Dublin in 1968 was a city of contradictions and historical complexity that shaped every aspect of life within its boundaries. The capital of the Republic of Ireland, Dublin was a bustling urban center of approximately 1 million people, a city where medieval history collided with contemporary modernity, where ancient traditions persisted alongside contemporary change, where the past refused to fully release its grip on the present. The physical landscape of Dublin bore the marks of its complex history. Medieval architecture, churches, castles, narrow winding streets designed for an earlier era, existed uneasily alongside modern buildings, contemporary development, new commercial structures built to serve contemporary commerce and contemporary needs. The city had neighborhoods that ranged from wealthy, prestigious areas with grand Georgian and Victorian houses, tree-lined avenues, private gardens, and substantial grounds, to poor and working-class neighborhoods characterized by tenement housing, industrial areas, narrow streets, overcrowded conditions, and economic deprivation. Dublin was a city shaped profoundly by its history. The city bore the marks of British colonization, centuries of foreign rule, economic exploitation, cultural suppression. The city bore the marks of Irish independence struggles, rebellions, executions, resistance, determination. The city bore the marks of the transition from British rule to Irish independence, the Easter Rebellion of 1916, the Irish War of Independence, the Irish Civil War, the creation of the Irish Free State, and later, the Irish Republic. The Irish Civil War, which had ended in 1923, only 45 years before Father O'Donnell's death in 1968, had left deep scars on Irish society. The conflict between those who supported the Irish Free State and those who opposed it as insufficiently independent, the conflict between those who accepted the partition of Ireland and those who rejected it, had divided families, destroyed friendships, created enmities that persisted across decades. Irish nationalism was strong in 1968. Irish identity was tied closely to Irish independence, to the breaking of free from British rule, to the assertion of Irish sovereignty, to the reclamation of Irish culture and Irish language. The memory of centuries of British rule, the memory of Irish resistance, the memory of achieving independence, were central to Irish national consciousness. Within this context of Irish history and Irish nationalism, the Catholic Church occupied a position of extraordinary importance. The Church had played a crucial role in maintaining Irish culture, Irish language, Irish identity during centuries of British rule. The Church had been a source of comfort, continuity, and cultural preservation through periods of struggle and suffering. The Church had baptized Irish children, educated Irish youth, married Irish couples, buried Irish dead, provided spiritual comfort through times of hardship. Because of this historical role, because of the Church's association with Irish identity and Irish resistance to British rule, the Church occupied a position of reverence and respect in Irish national consciousness that would be difficult for contemporary people to understand. The Church was not merely a religious institution providing spiritual services to believers. The Church was woven into the fabric of Irish identity, Irish culture, Irish nationalism. Ireland in 1968 was a nation where the Catholic Church wielded extraordinary institutional power. The Church was not merely a religious institution. The Church was a political power, a social institution, an educational institution, a healthcare institution, an authority that shaped Irish society in fundamental ways. The Church controlled education in a comprehensive way. The vast majority of schools in Ireland were church-run Catholic schools. The Church determined educational curriculum, determined what was taught, determined what values were emphasized. The Church educated Irish children from primary school through secondary school. The Church's influence over education meant that the Church shaped the intellectual development, the moral development, the value formation of Irish youth. The Church controlled much of health care. Hospitals, nursing homes, clinics were often church-run institutions. The Church employed nurses, doctors, administrators. The Church determined healthcare policy at its institutions. The Church's influence over healthcare meant that the Church had authority over life and death matters, over intimate personal situations, over vulnerable people seeking medical care. The Church had significant influence over government policy. Church positions on moral and social issues were given considerable weight by elected officials. Church bishops and archbishops could speak to political matters, and their words carried weight in political circles. Church teaching influenced the development of Irish law. The church was deeply embedded in Irish national identity. To be Irish was, in a very real sense, to be Catholic. Catholicism was not merely a personal faith, but a cultural identity, a national identity, a fundamental aspect of what it meant to be Irish. Non-Catholics in Ireland were a small minority: Protestants, Jews, others. They were accepted, but were aware of their minority status. The Irish people were overwhelmingly Catholic. Church attendance was high. Church participation was central to community life. The church structured social life, parish communities, social organizations, charitable institutions, social gatherings, celebrations were often organized through or connected to the church. The Catholic Church in Ireland maintained strict control over moral and social issues. The church opposed divorce. The church opposed contraception. The church opposed abortion. These were not merely statements of religious teaching. These were enforced through law. Divorce was not legal in Ireland, reflecting church teaching. Contraception was not widely available in Ireland, reflecting church opposition and legal prohibition. Abortion was absolutely prohibited, reflecting church teaching encoded into Irish law. The church had influence over sexual morality, family structure, and personal behavior. The church's teachings on these matters were accepted by the vast majority of Irish people. The church's moral authority was recognized and respected. Within this context of church power and institutional authority, the Catholic Church maintained an image of moral authority and spiritual leadership. Priests were regarded as spiritual leaders, as moral exemplars, as representatives of God on earth. The priesthood was respected. The priesthood was revered. Priests occupied a position of honor in Irish society. But beneath this image of moral authority and purity, there were secrets. There were scandals that the church worked vigorously to conceal. There were crimes that the church protected its members from having to answer for. There were misconduct and improprieties that the church covered up rather than addressing. The church's power to control information, to discourage disclosure, to protect its members from accountability, was substantial. The Rathmines district of Dublin was a middle-class, respectable neighborhood characterized by Victorian and Edwardian architecture. The district contained churches, schools, businesses, comfortable residential streets. The architecture reflected the prosperity of the neighborhood: solid buildings, well-maintained properties, an atmosphere of respectability and permanence. In this neighborhood, in this era of church power and institutional authority, in this Dublin city shaped by history and nationalism and religious influence, Father Michael O'Donnell lived and worked. In this neighborhood, in this context, he would be murdered, and the murder would be concealed by the very institution he had served. Father Michael O'Donnell was born in 1916 in Dublin, Ireland, making him 52 years old at the time of his death in 1968. He had been a Catholic priest for approximately 25 years, having entered the seminary in his late 20s and having been ordained in the early 1940s. Michael O'Donnell came from a respectable middle-class Catholic family in Dublin. His parents had been people of some standing in their community. His father, also named Michael, had been a businessman involved in import and export trade. His father had been relatively prosperous, had provided a comfortable living for his family. His father had been respected in business circles. His father had been active in church affairs. His mother, Elizabeth, had been a homemaker, a woman of the professional middle class who was educated, cultured, and engaged with community activities. His mother had come from an educated family. His mother had been trained to manage a household, to raise children, to participate in community charitable activities. His mother had been active in parish activities, had attended church regularly, had been known in the community for her piety and her charitable works. Michael had grown up in a household where Catholic faith was central and fundamental to family life. The O'Donnell household was devout. Religious observance was practiced daily. Church attendance was regular and consistent. Prayer was part of daily family life. The teachings of the church were accepted without question. The church was respected and obeyed. Michael had also grown up in a household where the priesthood was regarded as a noble calling, as a path that a son might take that would bring honor to his family. The idea that one's son might become a priest was generally considered a blessing, an honor for the family, a sign of the family's standing and virtue. Families with sons who became priests were regarded as especially blessed, especially virtuous. Michael had been educated in Catholic schools run by the church. He had attended primary school in a Catholic school. He had attended secondary school in a Catholic school. He had been exposed to church teachings throughout his education. He had been encouraged by priests and teachers to consider a vocation to the priesthood. He had been told repeatedly that service to the church was a worthy calling, that the priesthood was a noble profession, that becoming a priest would bring honor to his family and would constitute a life of meaning and service. Michael had shown aptitude for studies as a young man. He had done well in his academic subjects. He had been intelligent, thoughtful, capable. He had developed a reputation as a bright student with potential, a student who might pursue a professional career of some kind. As Michael approached adulthood, the question of his vocational path became increasingly important. His parents discussed with him the possibility of his entering the priesthood. Priests from his parish church had spoken with him about the possibility. Family friends had suggested that he had the qualities needed for priesthood. In his late 20s, after completing secular education and working briefly in a non-religious profession, Michael had made the decision to enter the seminary. This decision had been celebrated by his family. His parents had been proud. His extended family had been pleased. He had made the decision to pursue a religious vocation, to dedicate his life to service in the church, to pursue a path that his family and his community regarded as noble and honorable. Michael had entered the seminary in approximately 1938 or 1939, when he was in his late 20s. The seminary was a rigorous educational institution designed to prepare men for the priesthood. It was not merely a school, but a total environment designed to transform a man, to prepare him mentally, spiritually, and emotionally for the demands of priesthood. The seminary curriculum was demanding and comprehensive. Michael had studied theology, the study of God and religious doctrine, the systematic study of Christian belief. He had studied philosophy, the study of fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, morality, and values. He had studied Scripture, the Bible and church teachings drawn from Scripture. He had studied church history, the history of the church from its origins to the contemporary period. He had studied Latin, the language of the church's liturgy and official documents. He had studied various other subjects related to the priesthood and church ministry. In addition to academic studies, the seminary had prepared Michael for the demands of celibacy and religious life. Celibacy was a fundamental requirement of the Catholic priesthood. A priest was required to remain unmarried, to forego sexual relationships, to dedicate himself to the church and to God, rather than to a family. Michael had been taught the theological justifications for celibacy. He had been taught that celibacy was a sacrifice made for service to God and the church. He had been taught that celibacy freed a priest from family obligations and allowed him to devote himself fully to his ministry. He had been taught that celibacy was a calling, a special grace granted by God, a sacrifice that would be rewarded in heaven. He had been prepared to accept the requirement of remaining unmarried, of forgoing sexual relationships, of dedicating himself to the church. He had been taught that celibacy was noble, that celibacy was holy, that celibacy represented a higher calling than marriage. Michael O'Donnell had been ordained as a priest in the early 1940s, probably around 1943 or 1944. He had gone through the ordination ceremony, a solemn religious ritual that marked him as a priest, that receiving the sacrament that marked him as a representative of the church, as someone authorized to conduct religious ceremonies, as someone authorized to serve as a spiritual guide to believers. Following his ordination, Michael had been assigned to a parish in Dublin. Over his 25-year career as a priest, he had served in various parishes. He had conducted masses, conducting the central religious service of the Catholic Church. He had heard confessions, listening to believers confess their sins, and providing absolution. He had performed baptisms, marking the entry of new members into the church. He had performed marriages, solemnizing the union of couples in the eyes of the church. He had performed funerals, conducting the last rites, and committing the dead to God's care. He had counseled parishioners, providing spiritual guidance, listening to personal problems, offering advice rooted in church teaching. He had conducted religious education, teaching church doctrine to parishioners. He had administered parish finances, managing the money that parishioners donated to the parish. He had managed parish facilities, maintaining the physical structures through which the parish conducted its work. He had most recently been serving as a priest in the Rathmines district of Dublin, at the Church of the Sacred Heart. He had been serving at this parish for approximately 8 years prior to his death in 1968. By 1968, Father O'Donnell had been serving as a priest in Rathmines for approximately 8 years. He was well known in the parish. He was a familiar figure to parishioners. He was respected by many people in the community. He had developed a reputation as a dedicated, conscientious priest who cared about his congregation, who was accessible to parishioners, who performed his duties with seriousness and commitment. But Father O'Donnell also had secrets. What those secrets were, the precise nature of what he knew, or what he was involved in, would remain unclear as the investigation into his murder was suppressed by church authorities. But there were suggestions that Father O'Donnell possessed knowledge of impropriety, possibly of misconduct by other clergy, possibly of corruption within the church hierarchy, possibly of activities that the church would prefer to keep concealed. The Rectory in Rathmines was a substantial Victorian house, typical of many buildings in the prosperous neighborhoods of Dublin. The Rectory was a large, multi-story building with numerous rooms, substantial grounds, a presence that commanded respect and conveyed institutional authority. The Rectory was architecturally impressive. The building had been constructed in the Victorian era, reflecting the architectural styles of that period. Solid construction, substantial materials, decoration suggesting prosperity and permanence. The building was well maintained, suggesting that the church invested resources in maintaining its property. The Rectory was where Father O'Donnell lived. It was his residence, his home, but it was much more than a personal residence. It was an institutional space, the home of a church official, a place where church business was conducted. It also served as an administrative center for the parish and as a meeting place for church business and church operations. The Rectory had a study, a formal room where Father O'Donnell conducted important business, where he met with church officials, where he met with parishioners who required his attention for significant matters. The study was furnished with a desk, bookshelves, comfortable chairs, religious artwork on the walls. The study conveyed authority, learning, institutional importance. The study was where important decisions were made, where sensitive matters were discussed, where the business of the parish was conducted. The Rectory had administrative offices where parish records were maintained, where parish finances were managed, where correspondence was conducted. These offices contained files, records, documents related to the parish's operations. These were secure spaces where important parish documents were stored. The Rectory had rooms where meetings could be held, where church officials could meet with each other, where community members could meet with church officials. The Rectory had a chapel for prayer, a space where Father O'Donnell could conduct private prayer, where he could attend to his own spiritual needs. The Rectory had living quarters for Father O'Donnell and for any other clergy who might be assigned to the parish. These quarters provided accommodation, privacy, comfort. The Rectory had a kitchen where meals were prepared. The Rectory had dining facilities. The Rectory had bathrooms and other conveniences. The Rectory also employed household staff, a housekeeper who maintained the building, managed household operations, prepared meals. The housekeeper had a key to the Rectory and had access to all areas of the building. The housekeeper was responsible for the day-to-day maintenance of the building, for ensuring that the building was clean and comfortable, for preparing meals for Father O'Donnell, and for any guests who might visit. The Rectory was the physical center of parish operations. From the Rectory, Father O'Donnell managed the parish. From the Rectory, he conducted correspondence with church hierarchy. From the Rectory, he received parishioners who came seeking his counsel or seeking assistance. From the Rectory, he managed the finances of the parish. The parish itself was a significant institution in the Rathmines neighborhood. The parish served Catholic residents of the area. The parish church was where Mass was conducted, where confessions were heard, where the sacraments were administered. The parish had schools, a primary school and a secondary school, where church-run education was provided to parish children. The parish had various organizations, altar societies, youth groups, charitable organizations, through which parishioners could participate in church life. On the evening of March 14, 1968, Father O'Donnell was in the Rectory, engaged in the normal conduct of his work. He had spent his day engaged in typical priestly duties, conducting Mass in the morning, hearing confessions from parishioners in the afternoon, meeting with parishioners who had come to him with problems or seeking his counsel, conducting administrative tasks related to the parish, responding to correspondence, managing parish finances. In the evening, Father O'Donnell received a visitor at the Rectory. The identity of this visitor was never clearly established by police. though there was investigation that went nowhere due to church interference. The visitor was someone who had come to the rectory to meet with Father O'Donnell on what appeared to be an important matter, a matter that required privacy, a matter that required a meeting in the rector's study. What conversation or interaction occurred between Father O'Donnell and this visitor was unknown. What was discussed, what was demanded, what precipitated the violence that followed, would never be fully understood, because the church's interference with the investigation prevented these crucial questions from being answered. The murder was committed in Father O'Donnell's study in the rectory. The study was a room where Father O'Donnell conducted business, where he met with church officials, where he met with parishioners who required his private counsel, where he did administrative work related to the parish. The violence that occurred in the study left evidence of struggle. Objects were disturbed. Furniture was overturned. The room bore evidence of a physical altercation between Father O'Donnell and his killer or killers. At some point during the evening or night of March 14, 1968, the violence occurred. At some point, Father Michael O'Donnell was murdered. The specifics of how the murder occurred, whether it was a sudden attack or whether there was a struggle, whether there were words exchanged before the violence occurred, whether Father O'Donnell realized the threat he faced, none of these details were clearly established. On the morning of March 15, 1968, the housekeeper who worked at the rectory arrived at her usual time. She was a woman in her 50s who had been employed at the rectory for several years. She had a set routine, arriving in the morning, beginning her household duties, cleaning, preparing breakfast, maintaining the building. When the housekeeper arrived at the rectory on the morning of March 15th, something was immediately wrong. The rectory was in disarray in ways that were unusual, that suggested something abnormal had occurred. Doors that should have been closed were open. Objects were not in their usual places. There was an atmosphere of disorder and disturbance. The housekeeper investigated. She went to the study. She discovered Father O'Donnell's body. Father O'Donnell was dead. He had been murdered. His body bore signs of violence. There was blood. There was evidence of trauma. The body bore marks suggesting that Father O'Donnell had been in a violent struggle with his attacker or attackers. The discovery created immediate alarm, immediate panic. The housekeeper screamed. She immediately contacted police. She also contacted church authorities. She was overwhelmed, traumatized by the discovery of her employer's dead body. Police arrived at the rectory within approximately 1 hour of the housekeeper's call. Police officers examined the scene carefully, trying to preserve evidence, trying to document what had occurred. Police photographers documented the scene from multiple angles. Police officers examined the body. Police officers began to interview the housekeeper and other staff members who worked at the rectory. Police began collecting evidence from the study where Father O'Donnell's body lay. Police photographed the scene from multiple angles. Police examined the body carefully. Police began to interview the housekeeper and other staff members who worked at the rectory. What police discovered during their initial investigation suggested several important details that would prove to be crucial to understanding what had happened. The discovery of blackmail materials. First, and most significantly, police discovered evidence of blackmail materials in Father O'Donnell's study. Police found documents, letters, financial records, and materials that suggested Father O'Donnell had been engaged in blackmail activities or had been the victim of blackmail activities. Among the materials discovered were letters that suggested payment of money. There were documents that suggested threats. There were records that suggested extortion. Whether Father O'Donnell was the blackmailer or a victim of blackmail was initially unclear, but the materials clearly suggested that blackmail was somehow connected to the study, connected to Father O'Donnell, and possibly connected to his death. Records of clergy activities. Second, police discovered that Father O'Donnell had maintained detailed records. These records appeared to document the activities, behaviors, and activities of other clergy members. The records were detailed and comprehensive. They suggested that Father O'Donnell had been systematically documenting information about other priests' conduct, other priests' behaviors, other priests' activities. Whether these records were related to the blackmail materials was initially unclear, but the combination of blackmail materials and detailed records of clergy activities suggested something more complex and more sinister than a simple crime of passion or a robbery. Evidence of church secrets. Third, there was evidence that Father O'Donnell had knowledge of improper conduct, of misconduct, of activities that should not have been occurring within the church, whether the evidence was explicit or implicit. There was clearly material in the study that suggested Father O'Donnell knew things about the church, about church officials, about clergy members, that the church would prefer to keep concealed. Police investigators began to develop theories about what might have motivated the murder. The initial theories centered on the blackmail materials and the records of clergy activities. Theory 1. Blackmail and extortion. Gone wrong. One initial theory was that Father O'Donnell had been involved in blackmail activities, that he had been using knowledge of improper conduct to extort money or favors from other clergy members or from church officials. According to this theory, his blackmail activities had eventually resulted in his murder, that someone he was blackmailing had decided to eliminate him to prevent further extortion, or to prevent exposure of the improper conduct that Father O'Donnell was using as leverage. Theory 2. Silencing knowledge of serious misconduct. A second theory was that Father O'Donnell had possessed knowledge of serious misconduct or crimes committed by other clergy members or by church hierarchy. According to this theory, the records that police found were documentation of this misconduct. According to this theory, Father O'Donnell had been murdered to prevent him from revealing what he knew, to prevent exposure of the misconduct, to protect the perpetrators of the misconduct. Theory 3. Conflicts within church hierarchy. A third theory suggested that there were significant conflicts within the church hierarchy, conflicts involving money, power, influence, and authority. Theory 3 suggested that Father O'Donnell might have been involved in these conflicts, might have been taking sides, might have been gathering evidence against one faction or another within church leadership. Police began to interview people who had contact with Father O'Donnell, trying to determine what he might have been involved in, trying to understand what secrets he might have possessed, trying to identify individuals who might have had motive to murder him. Within hours of Father O'Donnell's death being reported to police, church authorities became involved in the investigation. The most senior church officials in Dublin, the archbishop, bishops, and other high-ranking church officials, became aware of the situation. These church officials immediately expressed concern about the investigation. They expressed concern about the direction that the investigation might take. They expressed concern about what information might become public as a result of police investigation. They expressed concern about the potential damage to the church's reputation if details of Father O'Donnell's activities became public. Church authorities approached police leadership. Church officials claimed that certain aspects of the investigation fell under church jurisdiction rather than police jurisdiction. Church officials argued that internal church matters should be handled by the church rather than by secular authorities. Church officials argued that the church had a right to investigate its own clergy members, and that police investigation of church matters was an intrusion on church autonomy. Church authorities began to claim that certain documents in Father O'Donnell's study were confidential church materials that should not be examined by police, that should not be included in official investigation files, that should be handled by the church rather than by secular authorities. Church authorities argued that certain witnesses, other clergy members, church officials, should not be interviewed by police without church authorization, that interviews would be disruptive to church operations, that church officials should be present during any police interviews. The most senior church officials in Dublin, the Archbishop of Dublin and other bishops, became directly involved in communication with police leadership. These church officials had authority and influence. They had connections to government officials, to police leadership, to members of the judiciary. They were able to exercise considerable pressure on the police investigation. Police investigators found themselves increasingly constrained by church authorities' interference with and obstruction of their investigation. The tension between police and church authorities became increasingly apparent and increasingly problematic. Restricting access to evidence. Police investigators attempted to examine certain church records related to Father O'Donnell, to examine financial records that might be relevant to understanding the blackmail materials, to examine records that might document the activities that Father O'Donnell had been recording. But church authorities refused to make those records available, claiming that they were confidential church materials protected by church-state relations and by church autonomy in internal matters. Restricting access to witnesses. Investigators attempted to interview certain church officials who might have had knowledge of Father O'Donnell's activities, who might have been subjects of the records that Father O'Donnell maintained, who might have had motive to murder Father O'Donnell. But church authorities restricted access to these officials, claiming that interviews could not be conducted without church authorization and without church officials present during the interviews. The church's restrictions on witness interviews effectively prevented police from conducting the kind of thorough investigation that would normally occur in a murder case. Police were prevented from asking questions that they considered important. Police were prevented from following up on potentially significant leads. Witness intimidation and discouragement. Additionally, police found that certain witnesses who might have provided important information were being discouraged from speaking to police. Church authorities were apparently communicating with witnesses, particularly witnesses who were church employees, and asking them not to cooperate with police investigations. The church was using its institutional authority to prevent witnesses from providing information to police. A crucial and highly suspicious detail in the investigation was the disappearance or destruction of certain documents and materials. Police had observed materials in Father O'Donnell's study that appeared to be blackmail materials or records of inappropriate conduct. Police had photographed some of these materials. Police had begun the process of cataloging and collecting evidence. But when police attempted to return to examine these materials more carefully, when police attempted to collect the materials as evidence for more detailed analysis, the materials had disappeared. The materials were gone from the study. They could not be located. Police asked church authorities about the missing materials. Church authorities claimed that they had no knowledge of what had happened to the materials. Church authorities suggested that perhaps the materials had been misplaced during the initial police investigation. Church authorities suggested that police officers might have misidentified what they had seen. Church authorities maintained that the church had not deliberately removed or destroyed any materials, but police investigators suspected otherwise. They believed that church authorities had deliberately removed the materials from the study, had destroyed the materials, or had otherwise ensured that the materials could not be examined by police. Police believed that someone with access to the rectory, church officials, church staff, had deliberately removed evidence. The disappearance of the materials was highly suspicious. It suggested that someone with access to the rectory had deliberately removed the materials. It suggested that someone with knowledge of what materials existed and what they contained had systematically removed evidence. It suggested that church authorities were covering up evidence, destroying evidence, attempting to prevent evidence from being examined by police. But police had no way to prove this. The materials were gone. Without the materials, without physical evidence, police could not establish what had been destroyed or who had destroyed it. As weeks passed following Father O'Donnell's death, the investigation made little progress toward identifying a suspect or determining a clear motive for the murder. The investigation stalled. The investigation lost momentum. Police had initially developed theories based on the blackmail materials and the records of clergy activities, but those theories could not be pursued vigorously because of church interference. Police had identified evidence that seemed important, that seemed potentially determinative, but that evidence had disappeared. Without the disappeared materials, without access to church records, without the ability to interview church officials, without witness cooperation, police had limited options for moving the investigation forward. Police leadership decided to reduce active investigation of the case. Police announced that the investigation would continue, but resources devoted to active investigation were gradually reduced. Other cases that demanded police attention were prioritized. The investigation into Father O'Donnell's murder became a lower priority. By late April 1968, approximately 1 month after Father O'Donnell's death, the investigation was effectively closed. The case remained officially open in theory, but active investigation had been essentially halted. Police announced that they did not have sufficient evidence to charge anyone with the crime. Police announced that the case would remain in open case files pending new evidence. While police investigation stalled, the church moved to manage the situation from an institutional perspective. Church authorities were concerned about public perception, about potential damage to the church's reputation, about potential public revelation of whatever secrets Father O'Donnell had possessed. Church authorities announced that Father O'Donnell would be given a formal funeral service in recognition of his 25 years of service in the priesthood. Church authorities arranged for the funeral to be conducted with appropriate solemnity and respect. Church authorities managed the messaging around Father O'Donnell's death, framing him as a dedicated priest who had been tragically murdered, without dwelling on the circumstances of his death or the investigation into his death. Church authorities made no public statement about the investigation, about the materials that had been found in Father O'Donnell's study, about the evidence of blackmail materials, about the records that Father O'Donnell had maintained. The church's position was silence on these matters. Church authorities worked to discourage public discussion of the circumstances of Father O'Donnell's death. Church authorities worked to discourage media investigation of the case. The church's institutional position was that the matter should be allowed to rest. that further public discussion would be disrespectful to Father O'Donnell and to the church. Church authorities used their influence to minimize media coverage. Church leaders were connected to newspaper editors, to media officials. The church was able to exercise pressure to limit how much the case was discussed in the media, to limit how much detail was provided about the investigation, to limit public attention to the case. Father O'Donnell's family, his parents had died years earlier, but he had siblings and extended family, struggled to understand what had happened. They had lost a family member to murder. They had lost someone who had dedicated his life to the priesthood, who had served the church faithfully for 25 years. They were grieving, experiencing the shock of sudden death, the pain of loss, the confusion of not understanding what had happened. But beyond their grief, they were troubled by unanswered questions. They were troubled by the rapid closure of the investigation. They were troubled by the church's apparent lack of concern about finding Father O'Donnell's murderer. They were troubled by the silence, by the apparent cover-up, by the sense that the church knew more than it was revealing. Father O'Donnell's siblings questioned why the investigation had been closed so quickly. They questioned why church authorities had interfered with the investigation. They questioned why the police investigation had not proceeded further. They questioned why there were no answers, no arrests, no justice. Father O'Donnell's extended family was similarly troubled. They had regarded Father O'Donnell as a member of the family, as someone who had dedicated his life to a noble calling. Now he was dead, murdered, and no one seemed to be working to find out who had killed him or why. Colleagues who had worked with Father O'Donnell in the church were also troubled. Some of them wondered what secrets Father O'Donnell had possessed. Some of them wondered whether the secrecy surrounding the murder, the interference with the investigation, had something to do with church matters that the church did not want publicly revealed. Parishioners who had known Father O'Donnell and who had relied on him for spiritual guidance were confused and troubled. They had regarded Father O'Donnell as a spiritual leader, as a moral exemplar, as someone worthy of trust. His death was shocking and disturbing. The fact that his death was being treated as a matter to be covered up rather than investigated was troubling to them. But questions went largely unanswered. The case was closed. No answers were forthcoming. The church maintained its silence. The institutional power of the church prevented the truth from emerging. The murder of Father Michael O'Donnell remained officially unsolved. The case was filed away in police archives. The case was largely forgotten by the public, overshadowed by other news, other events, other crimes that demanded public attention. Over the decades that followed the murder, the case received minimal attention. It was not a case that was actively investigated. It was not a case that received significant media coverage. It was a closed cold case, a file stored in police archives, a historical record of an unsolved murder. Periodically, the case would resurface, when researchers studying church history in Ireland would encounter references to the case, when journalists would investigate old unsolved murders in Dublin, when family members or interested parties would attempt to keep the case alive in public memory. But the investigation did not progress. No new evidence emerged. No arrest was ever made. By the 1980s, Father O'Donnell's murder had become largely historical. By the 1990s, it was a historical footnote, a reference point in discussions of church history, but not a case that received active attention. By the 2000s and 2010s, it was a cold case that few people remembered or discussed. The passage of time meant that witnesses aged and died, documents were lost or destroyed. Memories faded. The opportunity to investigate the crime thoroughly passed away. The case of Father Michael O'Donnell's murder became emblematic of how powerful institutions, particularly religious institutions, could interfere with justice, could obstruct investigations, could protect their own institutional interests at the expense of solving serious crimes and bringing perpetrators to justice. The case demonstrated the extraordinary power that the Catholic Church wielded in Irish society in 1968. The Church was able to exercise influence over police investigation. The Church was able to prevent evidence from being examined. The Church was able to suppress information. The Church was able to use its institutional authority to discourage witnesses from cooperating with police. The case demonstrated that the Church prioritized its own institutional interests and its reputation above justice. The Church had been more concerned about protecting its reputation, about preventing public revelation of church secrets, than about ensuring that the person who murdered Father O'Donnell was brought to justice. The Church had been more concerned about maintaining institutional control and institutional authority than about finding answers for a murdered priest. The case demonstrated the vulnerability of individuals within powerful institutions. Father O'Donnell had been a priest, a member of the church hierarchy, someone with institutional authority, but when he was murdered, his death was used as an opportunity for the church to exercise power, to suppress evidence, to prevent investigation. Father O'Donnell's death became an institutional matter to be managed, rather than a crime to be solved. The impact of Father O'Donnell's unsolved murder extended beyond his immediate family. The case affected parishioners who had known Father O'Donnell, who had relied on him for spiritual guidance, who had trusted him. The case raised questions about the church, about institutional integrity, about whether the church was worthy of the trust and respect that was given to it. The case affected clergy who worked with or knew Father O'Donnell. They were confronted with the reality that their institution would prioritize reputation and institutional interests above justice. They were confronted with the reality that their institution would interfere with murder investigation to protect its own interests. The case affected the broader Irish Catholic community, though the full extent of that effect was difficult to measure because the church successfully suppressed public discussion of the case. Over decades, as more information about church scandals emerged, particularly beginning in the 1990s and continuing into the contemporary period, the case of Father O'Donnell's murder took on additional significance. It became clear that the church's pattern of covering up misconduct, of protecting perpetrators, of interfering with investigation, of prioritizing institutional interests above justice, was not unique to Father O'Donnell's death. It was a pattern that had characterized the church's response to many situations involving misconduct or crime. The church had covered up abuse. The church had protected abusers. The church had transferred priests accused of crimes to new parishes, where they could continue to commit crimes. The case of Father O'Donnell's murder was recognized as an early example of this pattern, an early demonstration of the church's willingness to interfere with justice to protect itself. In 2025, approximately 57 years after Father Michael O'Donnell's death, the case remains officially unsolved. The case remains in cold case files in Dublin. The case remains one of Ireland's unsolved historical murders. Who murdered Father Michael O'Donnell? The question remains fundamentally unanswered. The investigation was closed without identifying a clear suspect or determining definitively who had committed the crime. The police investigation stalled in 1968, and the case has never been actively reinvestigated. What secrets did Father O'Donnell possess? What blackmail materials existed? What records did he maintain? What information was so important that the church worked so vigorously to suppress it? These questions remain largely unanswered, though speculation and available fragments suggest that whatever secrets Father O'Donnell possessed, they involved the Catholic Church and its officials, possibly involving misconduct or improper conduct that the church did not want publicly revealed. Why did the church work so hard to interfere with the investigation? What was the church protecting? What truth was the church desperate to conceal? Why was the church willing to allow a murderer to escape justice in order to protect its own institutional interests? These questions remain unanswered. The church hierarchy has never publicly explained its actions. The church has never acknowledged its role in obstructing the investigation. Were church officials themselves involved in Father O'Donnell's murder? Did church authorities have knowledge of who committed the murder? Did church authorities participate in the cover-up? Did church authorities protect the perpetrator? These questions remain unanswered, though the vigor of the church's interference with the investigation suggests that church officials may have had direct knowledge of or involvement in the crime. Father Michael O'Donnell remains a victim of an unsolved murder. He remains a reminder that even within religious institutions dedicated to moral authority and spiritual leadership, violence can occur. He remains a reminder that institutional power can be used to conceal violence rather than to seek justice. He remains a reminder that justice can be sacrificed to protect institutional interests. The case of Father O'Donnell's murder remains a dark chapter in the history of the Catholic Church in Ireland, a reminder that the Church, despite its claims to moral authority, prioritized its own institutional interests over the pursuit of justice for a murdered priest, over the pursuit of truth about what he knew, over the pursuit of accountability for his death. The mystery persists. The truth remains concealed. Justice remains elusive. The case stands as a monument to the power of institutional self-protection, to the vulnerability of individuals within powerful institutions, to the difficulty of seeking truth when that truth threatens institutional interests.